I don't like walking on hardwood or tile floors without a slipper, or I have to have shoes on. I can't just have my foot touch a hard surface and not be really uncomfortable.
Neurodivergence brings with it a whole host of sensitivities. Sometimes it's the texture of certain foods. Sometimes it's a sound that you may find to be unbearable. Today, we explore things that make people cringe, crash, or creep out. Jen Malia, author of Too Sticky, is here to help sort it all out. That's straight ahead on episode 134. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
A couple of things before we get to our conversation with Jen. You can still register for TIFOS, the Executive Function Online Summit, and get a wealth of information from a whole panel of executive function experts. The summit was held last weekend, but it's all still accessible to you. Look for a link in the show notes. Also, do you have a question about neurodiversity that you'd like to submit for our next Ask Me Anything episode? You can submit your questions by joining our Neurodiversity Podcast advocacy and support group on Facebook. There's a link in the show notes, and it just takes a minute to join us. We'll talk parenting and sensitivities next.
Gifted and special ed administrators and educators, we have officially released our new training course, Strategies for Supporting Twice Exceptional Students. The course is hosted by Emily Kircher-Morris and designed to help identify, understand, and educate our growing population of twice exceptional students. The course is a multimedia experience combining video elements, printable support documents, audio and video clips of experts in the field of gifted education, and real case studies. It's broken into 6 modules and comes in 2 versions. One designed so directors and administrators can conduct a classroom-style learning experience. The second version is for self-study, so participants can take the course on their own when it's convenient for them. The course is entirely in the cloud, and each module ends with a review quiz. Then a certificate is awarded that can be used to track continuing education credits. Once again, it's called Strategies for Supporting Twice Exceptional Students, and it's available now. Find the link in this episode's show notes, or go to neurodiversity.university. Or if you prefer, call the Neurodiversity Alliance at 929-445-8255.
Today, we are talking with Jen Malia. In addition to being an associate professor of English and creative writing at Norfolk State University, she is a journalist who has written about autism and neurodiversity in a wide range of publications. She's also written about her experiences being diagnosed as autistic and has published a children's book called Too Sticky: Sensory Issues with Autism. So, Jen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you for inviting me. This is great.
I've read some about your experience about being diagnosed as autistic, which happened since you've been an adult. So I was wondering if you could just share a little bit about that process and what it meant to you to have that diagnosis.
I always felt different as a child, but I didn't know, that I was on the spectrum. It wasn't something that ever crossed my mind. But when I was younger, I had a lot of trouble being around speaking around anyone other than adults and close family. So I was kind of that child that would sort of sit in the classroom and, never really said much of anything. I was always uncomfortable and felt anxious, but it didn't occur to me until I had children. So I have 3 kids, and it was actually my middle child who at first was having a lot of trouble when she was younger. At 18 months old, she was having a lot of there were lots of meltdowns. What I came to learn were autistic meltdowns. And it was really going through the process of trying to uncover what was going on with her that helped me understand what had always been, things that had been going on in my life too. So it was my own research that led me to the diagnosis. I was told by a lot of medical professionals that she had just a language delay and a language disorder, but I knew that there was more to it. So I spent a lot of time doing my own research and uncovered not only that that she was on the spectrum, but came to learn that I was too.
What was it that prompted you to keep looking?
I noticed that there was a lot more that was setting her off than communication issues. So some of those things would be like changes to routines and just having very specific interests in certain colors and fabrics for, clothing, having favorite outfits that if they weren't available, then she would pull them out of the laundry hamper, wanting to wear them. So it was like a really restricted way of just trying to uncover, what was it beyond language that was frustrating for her. And for her, it was a lot more than it was sensory issues. It was restricted interests. It was just social communication with other kids, beyond just being able to use her own vocabulary that she did have. She wasn't nonverbal. She did have, a certain number of words that she could use. She was just delayed with the amount of language that she had. But even just like parallel play, playing with next to her brother and sister, but not necessarily playing with them. And she used to line up her toys, which is something I did as a child too. I would line up all my toys. I would keep them in perfect condition and not play with them. And then I actually grew up with a neurotypical brother who taught me how to play. And I think she also eventually learned how to play with her toys. But at first it was like analyzing the parts of toys and, doing all the kinds of things that now I understand are more traits that we think of as being on the autism spectrum.
So as you reflected then on your own childhood, you saw some of those parallels, for example, like you said, with how she played with the toys and how you sometimes would play with the toys. What other parallels did you notice?
I think also just in terms of her personality, like I don't think everyone on the autism spectrum is necessarily introverted. I've met other autistic people who are extroverted. I'm a very introverted person, and so is she. But I think she also had that kind of anxiety that I could just see in terms of being in social situations, even at a young age. I think it was hard for her to even say hi to a teacher when she would walk into a classroom. Those kinds of little things that you notice because you go through those as well. Like I still have trouble with, if I'm uncomfortable, go to a new situation, go to a new place that I've never been before. I mean, I'd rather go to the same grocery store and the same gas station every time just so I know exactly what to expect. And I noticed those things too with my daughter because she didn't like if we were just going to turn up somewhere and she had no idea where we were going and it was somewhere we had never been before.
Yeah. How old is she now?
She's 8. And I also have a 10-year-old daughter and a 7-year-old son. So she got diagnosed though when she was 2 years old and I was 39 at the time. And then my son, he's now 7, but he was diagnosed when he was 2 years old. And interestingly enough, my oldest was the one that was diagnosed last. So she got her diagnosis at 7 years old. And that was despite me taking her and already suspecting that she was autistic when I took my son a year after I took my my other daughter. So it was interesting because the journey was different, I think, because she was a lot more outgoing and extroverted. So when I was talking earlier about being extroverted and, you can still be autistic and be very extroverted, my oldest was very social. And so the fact that she was actually able to socialize a lot more comfortably, it was harder, I think, to sort of understand that she still was on the autism spectrum, but that her difficulties were different. Like she has anxiety and she also happens to have ADHD and OCD. So there was a lot of overlap with that as well. And so that was harder to tease it out and understand. But she also gets really angry. She's like me in that I get angry a lot. And, just having things not go the way I expect them to can be enough to kind of set me off. And, that's the same way she is with me. And the other parallel I noticed that was really clear to me is that she yells at me a lot like I did with my mother. And it's not necessarily an autistic trait, but it just tends to be something that I think, I noticed that also with my son. He gets quite angry. Interestingly enough, my middle child, she does not get as angry and yell, but I think that it's sort of a an interesting thing to think about, because it's that getting easily frustrated, I think, that sometimes comes with the territory, not for everyone, but it does with my family. So just being what I do as a parent when she does that is I actually reflect on it. I don't yell back. That's like the worst thing to do. But I say, is that appropriate to talk to me like that? And she says no. And then she kind of restates it or says apologizes. And she now self-reflects on how she's not behaving appropriately. So it's kind of interesting how that works. Because when I was a kid, I remember getting so angry about so many things and yelling, being frustrated. I wasn't talking much outside of the home because I wasn't comfortable and I had a lot of anxiety. But let me tell you, when I was talking to my parents, I would get so frustrated and I would just, I thought I knew everything. That's another trait, I think, just thinking you know it all. And I always thought I knew better than the adults. Like I knew something that they didn't know and they didn't understand. And so I would end up, getting frustrated that they weren't listening to me.
Yeah, you mentioned how parenting autistic children has influenced you and how you parent. What other ways do you feel like parenting autistic children has given you a different perspective on things?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting too when I think about my own journey. Like I had different kinds of challenges with each decade of my life. So I think back to when it was really hard as a young child because I was so anxious and I was terrified of any kind of public speaking. And yet here I am as an adult. I'm in my mid-40s. And I find public speaking, not necessarily easy, but it's so much easier than it was for me when I was a child. The more challenging things for me now are being a parent, because I don't just have myself to take care of, but I have 3 young children who depend on me. And so it's not just taking care of myself anymore. It's taking care of them and my husband, my family of 5. And we're all neurodivergent, all 5 of us. So we all have our own challenges. And I think as a parent, being autistic and having experiences that I can kind of draw on with my parenting, knowing that I had similar challenges to my children, helps me to parent them better, because I can kind of draw on that experience and remember what it was like to be like that, at that age, how I felt and what I did, what I needed for comfort, with sensory differences that I have. And it helps me, if I take them into a new environment, I try to introduce them to where we're going. And if I notice that they're having sensory overload, covering their ears, or they feel uncomfortable because it's a big crowd, I'll kind of remove them from the environment, or they don't even have to tell me they need to leave. It's more just I sense it because I know what it's like to be there.
You mentioned specifically the sensory awareness that you have. It's clear that autistic individuals, and I would say neurodivergent people of other diagnoses as well, tend to process sensory stimuli differently than others. And you were mentioning this when you were first talking about your middle daughter and how she was originally diagnosed. It seemed like that was maybe the sensory piece was a contributor to some of the difficulties, but she didn't have the language to express that, or really maybe even the awareness of that. And I feel like that can be really tricky to notice. And sometimes people interpret things as behavioral, or like they don't always consider that it could really just be a sensory experience that's uncomfortable, that's causing some of the dysregulation.
Yeah, I think that's true. The sensory component is actually quite, it's interesting because my oldest daughter and we are both more sensory avoiders, whereas my other 2 are more sensory seekers. My younger daughter, she gives hugs really, really hard. And it's just something she does. And I've come to expect it. And she loves going to sensory gyms and just sort of jumping. She likes gymnastics. And my son, he loves bounce houses. They just want to bounce around, bang into things. And that's just what they love to do. It's interesting to see the differences too with the way that each of us have certain sensory things that we avoid. Like I don't like walking on hardwood or tile floors without a slipper, or I have to have shoes on. I can't just have my foot touch a hard surface and not be really uncomfortable. And I remember that from when I was a child, and still as an adult. I've got slippers everywhere and I just don't walk around unless it's carpet. I'm not walking barefoot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So along with all of those sensory differences that you notice and that you see in your kids, that is something that you kind of wanted to bring some awareness to, which led you to writing the book Too Sticky. Can you tell us a little bit about that book and what else kind of led into that process for you?
Yeah, so when I was thinking about writing a children's book, it wasn't actually something that I came up with, but I had been writing all these articles, like personal essays for the New York Times, Washington Post, and other outlets. And I actually had an opportunity. Someone asked me, would you be interested in writing a children's picture book? And I thought about it and I said, well, absolutely, because what a great way to spread autism awareness and acceptance by writing a children's book. And I had children that were in the target age group for a picture book, which is 4 to 8-year-olds. So it was really the perfect opportunity for me to do that. So I had been writing a lot about the kind of differences that often girls and women have in terms of, being able to, get a diagnosis. My daughter and I had a hard time at first getting diagnosed with our autism. So it was interesting when I thought about it. I was like, I want to tell the story of an autistic girl, and I wanted it to be in a school setting and a home setting. And I thought about STEM related kinds of stories. And I came up with a slime experiment. I thought, what a great way to show, someone like me who likes to avoid sticky hands. And so it was actually based on both a little bit of myself and also my kids. There's a kind of what we think of as a character that kind of combines the different experiences that I had and that my children had, a kind of composite character, if you will. And I wanted the story to reflect both the anxiety that she has over, the sticky hands, and also to show how she copes with it. So there's a lot of things that she uses, like a stress ball, different breathing techniques, and there's ways in which her parents support her, both getting ready for school in the morning, and then the father picks her up from school. So I wanted to show that support. And also her teacher provides her with some accommodations in the classroom, water and soap so she can wash her hands off immediately after the experiment. And so I wanted to show not how she overcomes her disability. I think that's a bad sort of stereotypical thing that we sometimes see in books like this. It's not that she overcomes her sensory issues, but she learns to find a way to cope with them so that she decides, she makes the decision that, yes, I'm going to participate in the slime experiment, and it's not forced upon her, but she takes these sort of techniques and accommodations that she has learned to use and is able to participate in the experiment with a little bit of assistance from the adults around her and also her classmates who encourage her.
I love that theme of autonomy, letting kids be the kind of experts of their own lives, as opposed to trying to push them into doing something they're not comfortable doing.
And the other reason I wanted to write this book is I felt that it was the book that I didn't know I needed, but I wish I had growing up as an undiagnosed autistic girl. So it was not just an opportunity for me to write something for my kids and other kids like them, but also to kind of write the book that I really could have used when I was growing up. So
yeah, you write a lot of articles as well for various publications. And I know that one of the things that you find important, because you often do this, is make sure that your primary sources are people who are autistic to talk about their experiences. Tell me why you feel it is so important to include autistic voices in this conversation.
I think it's really important to give autistic people a voice when they're talking about the same sort of challenges that they're experiencing in their everyday life, to have, input in that. And I think it's important I've learned a lot from experts who aren't autistic, about things that I didn't know. My sort of stereotypical view of autism before I got diagnosed was just what I saw in Rain Man. So I had no sort of concept of what is autism, what is neurodiversity. I had no idea, but I've learned a lot from experts who aren't on the spectrum. I learned a lot too from reading the memoirs and the personal essays of autistic people talking about their own experiences. So I find that, when I'm interviewing people for articles, whether, it's for the New York Times, I make sure I seek out as many sources as I can from autistic people. And I feel like they're the real experts on the experiences that, they have every day. It's really hard, I think, to imagine what it's like for an autistic person to just live in a world that's really designed for neurotypical people. Because let's face it, it's always, no matter how much we try to make accommodations, there's always going to be things that are just not designed for neurodivergent people. And it's just sort of trying to break away from that expectation. Like, as a neurodivergent person, I didn't know that I was neurodivergent growing up. And so I was always trying to fit in and be like what I thought was normal. And that was really a lot of anxiety for me. And I think that the opportunity to interview people who have experiences like that, that's the only way you can really access those experiences, I think, is by talking to people who go through them every day, who live them.
I think also, as the world works to become more neurodiversity affirming, the workplace is one of the spaces that I think is making a lot of changes, but is sometimes slower than some of us would like. What are some of the barriers that can face autistic adults in the workplace?
I think the biggest barrier is just that when you have an invisible disability, like being on the autism spectrum, I find that there's a lot of people that, first of all, think, well, if you can work a job, then you must not be autistic. They first of all don't even believe you. So that's the first barrier. That idea of like, it's not that I can really hide from it, even if I wanted to, because I'm public facing, with all of the things that I write. So it's not like my colleagues wouldn't know that I was on the autism spectrum, even if I didn't disclose it. But it's interesting because sometimes you'll get responses like, well, isn't everyone who's a professor a little autistic? Because just to get a PhD, you probably have to, those kinds of responses aren't very helpful, because it's almost like they're saying you should just deal with it and, try to fit in with the rest of us. We're all, a little bit odd because we are in academia, basically. So that's really the first barrier, I think, just being aware that, some people may have needs that you can't necessarily see immediately. And the other one would just be, it's really hard to ask for accommodations when you feel like, at least I feel that it's hard to ask for accommodations. Sometimes I don't even know what to ask for. I'm not really sure ahead of time what I'm going to need at any particular time. And I also feel like it's hard to ask for accommodations that are really going to make a difference, because I would say one of the most difficult things I have to do for my job is attending graduation ceremonies and, putting on regalia and standing in lines with closed, really close spaces and sitting close to other people and having a really loud blaring speaker, at the graduation ceremony. So those kinds of things are difficult for me, but then it's like, well, what do I ask for other than, can I stand at the end of the line, and can I wear headphones, noise canceling headphones to block some of the noise? There isn't really a lot I can ask for, but I'm still expected to do those things. So it's challenging, I think, sometimes to figure out what kinds of things you could even ask for that would help improve the situation.
Yeah, and there is definitely just that inherent ableism that is unnoticed by many people. I think even people who have a diagnosed disability, often it's even internalized. They don't even sometimes realize the pressure that they're putting on themselves. Is the publishing world a place that is welcoming to neurodivergent people?
Unfortunately, I don't think they are. I wrote a piece in Publishers Weekly about ableism in the publishing industry, and I talked about my own experiences. Generally, it seems to be that a lot of publishers, they are so used to publishing authors who aren't neurodivergent that these stereotypes that they see in those published works sometimes become the norm, and that's the expectation they have when they, sign on other authors. So when you come in with a more nuanced perspective that you want to capture in a book, it's almost harder, because you'll get comments like, well, this book is too quiet. She doesn't seem really that autistic, because they're looking for those kind of stereotypical things that maybe they're just familiar with, like hands flapping or, spinning or just kinds of not making eye contact. A lot of things that aren't necessarily the whole experience is what they're looking for, because that's really what perhaps, for a long time had been the norm in the publishing industry. Now, I think there's been more autistic authors and just neurodivergent authors in general starting to write more books, but there's just not a lot of representation. There's a handful of authors. I mean, most of us know each other. That's how small it is. We've presented on panels together because we are the only ones that are, autistic and also writing these books. And when it comes to picture books like Too Sticky, I mean, there are very few traditionally published picture books by autistic authors. So it gets even smaller when you're dealing with the younger age groups than when you go, further along for the higher age groups in the category.
So that kind of leads into my next question, which is about what new projects you have on the horizon, because you've got some things that are in the works in the publishing world. Can you share a little bit about those?
My next 3 children's books are not publicly announced yet, so I can't talk about them specifically, but I can say that they are also in all of the books that I have in progress and under contract are all neurodivergent characters. That's kind of the theme that I always write. I feel that there's so few books out there with neurodivergent characters well represented. And it would actually be harder for me to write from the point of view of someone who was neurotypical anyway, being on the spectrum. So I use it as a way to, to advocate for my kids, for myself, for other neurodivergent children and their peers so that they can have a better understanding and be more empathetic. That is really what I want to do. I'm actually pursuing an MFA in writing for children and young adults, even though I already have a PhD in English, because I felt that I really wanted to do as much as I can to create as many books. It's just something that it's one of my focused interests that I have as an autistic person. Writing for children is really what's taken off and become one of my special interests as an autistic person. So that's what I'm spending most of my time doing less freelance writing for newspapers and more writing for children right now.
That's awesome. It's really exciting. And I hope that, when those are available and out, we can maybe have you back and talk about some of those. My last question as we wrap up is this. If you had the opportunity to speak directly to an adult who had just recently received an autism diagnosis, perhaps following the diagnosis of their child, similar to your experience, what would you want them to hear? Or maybe even what would you have wanted to hear when you got your diagnosis?
I think I was really lucky when I got diagnosed, and I remember telling my parents about it, and they actually reacted in a way that I thought was, they said, we're sorry, we didn't know. They felt bad. I mean, I didn't feel like that they should have felt guilty about it. That wasn't what I was expecting at all. But I think that it was actually really, really affirming that they weren't in doubt of it, that they didn't. It just kind of came out of nowhere from their perspective, I'm sure, because it's like I went off to college, I got married, I had children. And then all of a sudden it's like, hi, well, guess what? You have an autistic daughter and now you have 3 autistic grandchildren. And it really, it was wonderful to have the support from my family. For me, by the time I got my diagnosis, it was actually relieving to have the diagnosis because I had been struggling throughout life, not knowing why things were so difficult for me. And then once I had children, not knowing why things were difficult for them. So once I had the diagnosis, it was life-changing in a good way. And it was certainly eye-opening and explained a lot for me. And I feel that now I don't mask as much as I used to. Like I was trying so hard to fit in and to act like other people. It's not that I can really erase that and just change the way that I act, but a lot of it's ingrained in me. But I at least feel more comfortable knowing that I'm going to act differently because that's just who I am. And autism is part of my identity. And I'm not ashamed of it. I talk openly about it. And I hope that my kids will also feel that they can be confident and draw on the strengths that they have. I like to think of it as I'm nurturing the strengths that my children have rather than focusing on their weaknesses. So everyone has challenges, but I think of it as, we are proud, I guess, to call ourselves autistic, and it's not a negative thing. And I think there's still a lot of stigma out there about autism, but that's slowly changing. With the neurodiversity movement, there's a lot more people that are more accepting. And at least 1 in 5 children are now neurodivergent. That's a really huge portion of the population. It is not a small part of, our society. So thinking of it in terms of what positive things can come from being diagnosed and understanding better, your own identity, I think it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. Jen Malia, author of Too Sticky: Sensory Issues with Autism. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.
Does your brain interpret sensory input differently than other people? Noises are my own personal neurodivergent sensory nightmare. Misophonia is a strong dislike for certain sounds. And for me, any little noise intrudes on my brain like a pickaxe. Someone tapping or listening to their phone at a level that is just within the range that I can hear it but not actually make out what's being said, or, God forbid, eating something. Thank goodness for noise-canceling earplugs. But I do have to ask, those of you who listen to ASMR, what is wrong with you? I'm kidding, of course. Since we recorded this episode, information about Jen's new series has been made public. The Rainbow Infinity Club is a chapter book series about neurodivergent 4th graders, and it will be available in 2023. Stories that talk about neurodiversity in a way that is accessible to all kids are so important. It helps in our mission to normalize the differences that neurodivergent people experience, and it helps make the world a more accessible place. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Don't keep me down. 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 Don't keep me down.
Thank you to Jen Malia. We invite you to learn more about her and find links to her work on the episode page at neurodiversitypodcast.com. Also, as the school year ramps up in many places, it's a great time to check out our continuing education course called Strategies for Supporting Twice Exceptional Students. There's a link in the show notes for more information. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our social media and production assistant is Krista Brown. The executive producer and studio editor, that's me, Dave Morris. For everyone here, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Don't keep me down. Don't keep me down. Don't keep me down. Don't keep me down. Don't keep me down.
This is a production of the Neurodiversity Alliance.